is actually one of the articles that is perhaps most read outside of anthropology. So people sometimes read this in an English class or a class that is not necessarily a literature class or a world cultures class. For our purposes, we're going to use it for two things. First of all, well, we're going to talk about it, but we're going to use it to think about the idea of fieldwork. Bohannon was one of the first and a very good and perceptive field worker. And so it will help us to understand what was going on in what we might call the classic period of anthropological fieldwork. But we're also going to use it to transition to the next class on language and the relationship between words, concepts, how language helps us to think, but also how difficult it is sometimes it can result in a very different configuration of the world. So we'll hopefully use this as a kind of transition piece between field work and the idea of language, which we'll be reading about for Tuesday. So I want to start off with the kind of the first part. So Laura Bohannon is about to go to the field and she's talking with some people. I feel like there's a sound. Let me hear a sound. What kind of a sound would that be? Strange sound. Just check if somebody's unmuted. An outside sound. I thought, okay. So a sound that I cannot control. All right, makes sense. So Bohannon begins, she's going off to do a round of field work, and she actually begins. Bohannon is an interesting person. She was an American. She was from the United States, but she was mostly educated, at least in her post-college training, in England, at I think Oxford. And so, here she is in some ways more following the British colonial model than the U.S. American model of fieldwork. So she says here that she is leaving Oxford for the Tiv in West Africa, and she runs into her one of her colleagues from England, one of her English colleagues, and they have a little conversation about Shakespeare. So Emma, what's her first idea about what's the deal of people and Shakespeare and all that stuff?
So she kind of believes that there might be a few differences with the overall outlook, or I'm using the wrong word, but everyone's gonna have that same exact vision or thought.
Yeah, she starts off with this idea that Shakespeare is everywhere, a universal character, and the plot will be easy to understand as long as you can, do some of the details, translate it. And she has this wonderful quote, which Emma gave us, which is, "Human nature is pretty much the same the whole world over." And so Bohannon is actually reading Shakespeare in a fairly, I would say, the way most of us Americans read Shakespeare as this kind of great universal poet or great universal person who is interpreted the world over all the same. And so, her claim is that the genius that is Shakespeare, since it is universal, and since human nature, people are pretty much the same, that she's going to be able to translate this when she arrives. Interestingly, she's already having a fight with somebody who probably knows Shakespeare better than she does or claims to. John, who's she fighting with?
Not exactly sure, but pretty much between the lines of like why are you in an English-speaking country? You don't even know Shakespeare. Like, I think
Yeah, well, her colleague there, and I was realizing that the whole since we share a language, sometimes people say the United States and England are two countries divided by a shared language, which is the sense that, you know, if you've ever been, you're like, wait a second, I thought this was English. I think I understand what's going on, but it's weird. And so what he's saying to her is that Shakespeare was a very English poet in the sense that he was very rooted in his place, and one can easily misinterpret the universal by misunderstanding the particular. So what he's saying to her is, you Americans don't understand Shakespeare because you don't understand the particulars of the very in England English experience that Shakespeare was writing from. And so anyway, he gives her a copy of Hamlet. She goes off to the field and basically she's going to test this out, or she gets a chance to kind of test out who is correct here. Is human nature pretty much the same the world over? Will they understand things exactly like she does? Or can you easily misinterpret the universal by misunderstanding the particular? So she goes off, and you know, there's a whole scene, of course, that she's trying to tell the story of Hamlet to the people there. And she ends up in a few problems, you might say. The first thing, for those of you who've read Hamlet, there's, you know, the appearance of a ghost, Hamlet's father, and she immediately has trouble with the ghost part of things. And that is an interesting, and like I said, this is going into the idea of language among the Tiv, and she specifies that, you know, it's not the same in other groups around them, but they don't believe that there's an individual personality that survives death. And so it's a little bit different. So I don't actually believe in ghosts, but if you tell me what a ghost, you know, if you said, I saw a ghost, I understand what you're saying, right? The concept is in my head because, you know, in some ways we grow up with the idea that our souls, or our individual personalities go on after we die. Even if you don't believe it, at least you do sort of have that in your repertoire because it's in our society. And in their group, you know, it's not that they don't believe in an afterlife, it's just that you are not there's not an individual personality that goes into that afterlife. So she's struggling with sort of omens and witches to try and convey this notion of a ghost. Of course, one of Hamlet's dilemmas is that, you know, as soon as his father dies, his mother remarries his uncle, so his father's brother. And from their perspective, that was a good thing. It's like, so for Hamlet, this is bad. And for them, this is good, that you should get married to your brother's wife when you die. And this is actually a custom. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about marriage and kinship. It's known as a levirate marriage. For those of you who are up on your Bible, this is something that Jesus is quizzed on by people because they said it was a tradition that if your husband passed away, you would marry the brother in order to keep the stuff in the family line. So this is a kind of an interesting cultural custom, which is not far away from certain parts of our own society. But it sort of takes away one of the central dilemmas that Hamlet was facing here, or one of the reasons he's getting so upset. And so Hamlet, of course, they had a tradition in which people should should be married to one person at one time. And in their society, they're like, no, it's, you know, the king should have a lot of wives. How will they run things, or how will they keep the labor up? And then, you know, one of the central dilemmas in Hamlet is that whether or not, or how he is supposed to avenge his father's death, or what he believes is his murder. And for them, this is, again, a non-issue. They would say that you don't have the right, the son, the generation in which Hamlet belongs, has no right to avenge the death. That at the most, he should go to the age mates of the father, the people in the same generation, and they'll be able to take on what's going on. So you have sort of some of the central pieces and the central dilemmas of that Hamlet is wrestling with, those things that she was thinking were be human nature all over the world, and they're just turning them on their heads. They're turning them upside down and messing with her. Now they make some really interesting connections and have different interpretations on this. You might call them rich points of connection. So they, you know, they come up with an interesting idea of the story. But in some ways, what Bohannon is discovering is that they also have a kind of ethnocentric perspective on things. And so there's a couple of really interesting quotes in the article, you know, when they're like, you know, they're going through the story and, you know, they're kind of fighting about the interpretation of things. And they are like, hey, yeah, you have different customs and your clothes are different and stuff, but people are the same everywhere, which is kind of what Bohannon thought at the beginning, right? That human nature is the same everywhere. And now they're telling it back to her, but she's like, wait a second, this is not the same that I thought it would be. And then, of course, at the end, you know, they get through this story and they're like, yeah, you should tell us some more stories. And we who are, you know, the wise people here are going to tell you what they really mean, the true meaning of these stories. So this is a very, I think, hopefully an interesting exercise in both ethnographic field work and also kind of the deep cultural differences that Bohannon discovers, at least for her. So for Bohannon, this article, I think when she experiences this, is that, you know, it's not that she's saying people are not the same, but it's certainly a lot different than what she thought going in. Certainly a lot of things that she believed about that they would sort of grasp or interpret the same way turns out to be quite different. And that the idea that of what we might call, we talked about this a bit in the last class, the easy cultural relativism, where it's like, okay, you know, you have your thing, I have my thing, but we can get along. Bohannon is a person who really appreciated the difficulties of that, how that was something that you had to work at, and how understanding a person's point of view didn't necessarily mean that you were going to like it or agree with it. And so it's a difficult process to go through. And, you know, I mean, I think as we just saw in those quotes, that they themselves also believe in this idea of the universal human nature, or differently put, they don't believe in that deeper difference that Bohannon is finding out as she goes along. As I said, this article is also hopefully our transition point into thinking about language, because a lot of people view language as simply an exercise in view translation as simply, oh, well, your word for this is, you know, if this is a table, well, my word for that is mesa, and that's a chair or a silla. No, you know, that words are just kind of have a one-to-one correspondence, and that there's sort of one world out there, and we just talk about it with different words. And for Bohannon, what she's discovering here and talking to us about is that there's a whole kind of conceptual realm in which certain things are arranged differently, that reality itself is arranged differently, and it's not simply an issue of being able to swap out a different word and come up with the same idea. Again, we'll be talking about this much more extensively in our next set of readings. I think this article has, at least, I think one of the things that helps it to endure as an article that gets shared is it has a number of different interpretations that you can have. I like to, the primary interpretation, I think, is about cultural difference, discovering some of those differences. But we could also do a kind of, what we share across societies. So one of the things we could talk about is that, in all societies, or people tell stories and they interpret those stories. And that's what they're trying to do here, is do an exercise in storytelling. As we'll see in a couple classes, humans are meaning-making creatures. We like to make meaning of things. Or I guess we've talked about this in terms of culture, that humans can't help but see symbolic associations, even in places where there's sort of random dots or burn marks in a piece of toast. We see faces, we see different associations in the world. And so we like to interpret things, we like to find the meaning, and we do that through storytelling. Aha, that's what I meant to say, that we are thinking about the world symbolically, and we in some ways can't help but think about or interpret the world symbolically. We talked about this a little bit, that Bohannon begins with this kind of the ethnocentric perspective of people being the same all over the place, and they also have the ethnocentrism back, or that both sides in their own way have an ethnocentric perspective. You could also say that we share morality, that there is a sense of what is right, what is good to do, and what is wrong or what is bad. And so all over the world, people do have moral codes and moral ideas about the right and the wrong. But certainly what we find from this story is that that can be almost the opposite. So you might have the moral code that you should marry your mother's brother. That's a good thing. It can be a very different idea than what in other societies you should or want to do or think is the right thing to do. So there's